In 1939, what was the state of the militaries? What were the most powerful militaries on the world stage at that time?
Well, in terms of naval power, it's Britain, as we've already discussed, and the United States. France has a pretty large navy. Japan has a pretty large navy. Italy has a pretty large navy, but Italy's navy is by far and away its most modern aspect of its three services, air, land, and sea. But it doesn't have any aircraft carriers and it doesn't have any radar. So, it's they've got modern battleships and battle cruisers, but without key modern bits of technology.
So Italy is really not ready for war.
Oh, it's so not. It's so not. It's just, again, both Hitler and Mussolini, they lack geopolitical understanding. That's because they're so kind of focused on their narrow worldview, and they view everything through that prism, but they can't see that bigger picture.
And we should say that Mussolini, maybe you can correct me, but I don't think at any point he wants war.
He doesn't want a war. What he does want is he wants his own new kind of Roman Empire, which extends over the Mediterranean, the kind of certainly the eastern part of the half of the Mediterranean, North Africa, all the way down to kind of East Africa, controlling the Suez Canal. That's what he wants.
And I think he made clear that he was. I mean, there's always like this little brother jealous of Hitler kind of situation because he wanted absolute power the way Hitler did,
but doesn't have it.
Doesn't have it. And
It's
describe. Yeah, there's a
monarchy. Often forgotten. It's amazing.
So there's always this limit, and Hitler, quite brilliantly, once he gets some power, he takes it all.
Yeah.
Complete.
He completely emasculates Mussolini. And he likes him, though. It's really weird. Even when Mussolini's about to fall in July 1943, he has a meeting at Feltre, just literally a few days before Mussolini tumbles, and he does that because he likes Mussolini. He likes him as a man and thinks he's been his friend, and he respects him to a certain extent, even though he definitely views himself as top dog. Hitler does, that is. So it's kind of curious because I don't think Hitler particularly likes anyone really, but he does seem to like Mussolini. But anyway, the problem with Mussolini is Mussolini's Italy is very impoverished from the First World War. And that of course leads to the rise of fascism and the overthrow of parliamentary democracy, and why Mussolini takes place in the first place. Again, it's that kind of, there's been this terrible disruption, there's been financial crisis, that leads to kind of people looking at an alternative. What's the alternative? Well, Mussolini's going, we can be proud Italians again, lots of chest thumping, wearing great uniforms, all the rest of it. And people kind of think, well, I'll have a piece of that. And it kind of works. And, proverbially the trains work on time under him and so on and so forth. But he just gets ahead of himself, and actually the writings on the war in 1935 when he goes into Abyssinia and again, sort of what effectively are kind of, by first world European standards, primitive tribesmen in Abyssinia, they have quite a tough fight there. They do prevail, but it's not a complete walkover, and they get a bit of a bloody nose at times, and they shouldn't have done. And they're just not ready. They don't have the industry. They're tied up into the Mediterranean. They don't have access to the world's oceans. They do have some merchant shipping, but not a huge amount. They just don't have what is required. They're dependent on Britain for coal. Britain is the leading coal exporter in the world in the 1930s. So Britain's approach to fascist Spain and approach to fascist Italy has been very much sort of stick and carrot. It's like, we'll let you do what you do as long as you kind of stay in your box, and we'll continue to provide you with supplies and coal and whatever it is you need as long as you don't kind of go too far. And so that's why Mussolini is very anxious in 1938 and again in 1939 to kind of be the power broker and kind of not let Germany go to war. But Germany's just, they signed the Axis Pact of Steel in May 1939, where they become formal allies. This is Hitler and Mussolini, Italy and Germany. But it's always a very, very unequal partnership right from the word go. And one of the reasons Mussolini signs it is because he fears that Germany has designs on Italy.
Yeah.
It's not because he thinks, oh, these guys are great. They're our natural bedfellows. It's so that he can. It's a mutually convenient pact whereby Germany gets on with whatever it wants to do up in Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. Italy is given a free hand to do whatever it wants to do. They'll just kind of watch each other's backs. They have borders, Austria and Italy border one another, and they'll just do their own thing, and they'll kind of help each other out with supplies and stuff. But basically, they won't. They'll be their own. It's a kind of marriage of convenience. They're never expecting to be fighting alongside each other on the battlefield. Not really. There is a kind of obligation to do so, but it's an obligation with no expectation of ever actually happening. And so from Mussolini's point of view, the Pacta Steel is kind of, it's just sailing your flag to one particular mast and kind of trying to cover your back. And so long as he plays his cards right, he can still get his coal supplies from Britain. He doesn't have to worry about that. The Pacta Steel doesn't make any difference to that. The problem for him is that in June 1940, he thinks that France is about to be defeated and that Britain will surely follow. And so he thinks, I've got some rich pickings. I can take Malta, I can take British possessions, I can overrun Egypt, and now is my time. But I also need to kind of join the fight before France is completely out of the fight. Otherwise, it looks like I'm a Johnny come lately, and I won't get those spoils, because the Germans will go, yeah, you can't have all this stuff. You've turned up too late. You need to be in the fight. So he does it what he thinks is the perfect timing, and it turns out to be a catastrophic timing, because of course Britain doesn't exit the fight. Britain is still there. And, by February 1941, a very, very tiny British army in Egypt has overrun, 2 entire Italian armies and taken 133,000 prisoners in North Africa.
So you mentioned in the sea, who were the dominant armies? Who was dominant in the air?
Well, in the air, it has to be the Luftwaffe, and it is also the Imperial Japanese. Both in the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army, they both have air forces. And one of the reasons that is because the quality of the pilots in Japan is extremely high, because it's so difficult to get to the top position. You are going to your frontline squadrons with at least 500 hours in your logbook. To put that into some perspective, a British RAF or Luftwaffe pilot would be joining their frontline squadrons with 150 to 170 hours in the logbook. So it is that these guys are disciplined to within an inch of their lives. They are, there are academic tests as well as physical endurance tests. They are the elite of the elite, and they are extremely good. The problem they have is that there is a good number of them, but there's not that many. The Luftwaffe is the largest air force in the world in 1939, but it is already at a parity in aircraft production with Britain. And the French have a kind of similar size army, but they're very, very badly organized. So they're organized into different regions, and one region is not really talking to another. And one of the problems that when Case Yellow, the German invasion of the West, starts, France's army of the air is spread throughout France and has its own little areas. So you have one bunch of fighters and bombers in that block in the Marseille area. You have another block in kind of on the Brittany coast, and you have another block in around Sedan, and you have another that. So consequently, they're never able to kind of bring their full strength to bear. So it's although they've both got about 3,500 aircraft on paper, and about 2,500 that are fit to fly on any one given day, the Luftwaffe, because they're the aggressor, can choose how they mass their aircraft and where they attack and at when. So, in other words, the Luftwaffe can send over overwhelming amounts of bombers and fighter planes and pulverize a French airfield and catch them napping. And because the French don't have a defense system, they can't see whether they're coming. So their only hope is to kind of take off and just hope they stooge around the sky and hope they bump into some Luftwaffe. And of course, that's inherently inefficient, and they get destroyed. They get destroyed in penny packets rather than en masse. Difference with the RAF is the RAF is not done on an Air Force basis, where you have each Air Corps or Air Fleet has a handful of bombers, a handful of fighters, a handful of reconnaissance planes. They have different commands. So they have Bomber Command, Fighter Command, Training Command, Coastal Command, and they all have very specific roles. So they're structured in a completely different way. And and that's because they're an island nation, and because they see their role militarily in a different way, and because the rearming that Britain has done in the 1930s is all about defense. It is not about aggression at this point. Not about taking it to the enemy. It is showing you're tough, but also first and foremost getting your ducks in a row and making sure that you don't get defeated. So this is the principle behind the world's first fully coordinated air defense system, which is the radar chain. It is the observer core. It is control rooms. It is interesting technology such as identification friend or foe, IFF, which is where you have a little pulse, so you have these control rooms and you have a map table and you have a tote board in front of you where you can see what squadrons are airborne, what state of readiness they're at, whether they're engaging the enemy. Little lights come on and show you. You can see weather maps, you can see the cloud ceiling, you see all that at a glance. Then you're on a dais, and then down in front of you is a massive great map of southern England. You've got croupiers kind of moving plots, so you can, through a combination of radar, which picks up a kind of a rough idea of what's coming towards you, combined with the observer core, you have overlapping observer core stations all over Britain, covering every single inch of airspace over Britain, looking up into the air and seeing how many aircraft there are and at what height they are. And you have a little thing called a pantograph, which is a piece of equipment which helps you judge altitude. You then ring through that. That all comes into the control room along with the information from the radar stations, which is going into a single filter room at Fighter Command headquarters, which is then being pushed straight back out to the sector stations. So this information is being updated all the time. So you have a plot and it looks like it might be, enemy bombers 30 plus, for example. That's constantly being adapted. So as more information comes in, you will change that. And then you can see that actually it's only 20 aircraft or 22 aircraft or whatever. So you're updating that. And that little figure is put on your little plot and moved across. And so you can see, and then because you can identify your own aircraft, you can then see where they are moving. And you're also on the guys in the air are on the radio to ground controllers who are in these control rooms, and they're saying, okay, well, if you proceed at, Angels 18,000 feet, on a vector of, 150 degrees, you should be seeing your enemy bombing formation any moment now. And what that means is that you're not on the ground when the enemy are coming towards you with their bombers to hit your airfield, which means you're in the air, so that all they're doing is hitting a grass airfield, which you've already got bulldozers and diggers and graders and lots of scalpings and earth ready to fill in the potholes. And it means you're good to go. And it means, as a consequence of all that, when the Germans do launch their all-out assault on Adlertag, Eagle Day, on the 13th of August, 1940, the British are ready. They can see them coming, they know what to expect, and they can anticipate. And it means that they're not being caught with their trousers down on the ground. And as a consequence of that, of the 138 airfields there are in RAF airfields there are in Britain, only one of them is knocked out for more than 48 hours in the entire summer of 1940. And that's Manston on the tip of the Kent coast, which is abandoned for the duration.
So these are the two biggest air forces.
So those are the two biggest air forces.
So Luftwaffe, we should say German. I mean, they're like the legendary, the terrifying Air Force.
They are.
Maybe
they're slightly believing their own hype. There's no question about it.
Well, the rest of the world is also, right?
They've just had it too easy. So they don't have ground controllers. They don't have an air defense system in Germany, because why would you need an air defense system? We're going to be the aggressor. There's no scenario where we'll have to defend the airspace of the Third Reich because we're on the offensive. So they just haven't prepared it.
So there's that clash, the Battle of Britain, the clash of air forces. What explains the success of Britain in defending?
Well, and everyone always says, the few were the last line of defense against the Nazi hordes and all this kind of stuff. And it's all rubbish. They're the first line of defense. Second line of defense is the Royal Navy, which is the world's largest. And there is absolutely no chance on earth that a German invasion force made up of Rhine River barges, out of every three is motorized and the other two aren't, is ever going to get successfully across the English Channel. And even if they did, they would be repulsed. I mean, it's just no chance. And it is often forgotten that while the Luftwaffe is coming over and bombing Britain every single day, so is the RAF going over and bombing Germany. And one of the problems that the Germans have is that these bombers need fighter protection. Fighter planes are there to protect the bombers. And they don't have much fuel. and the Messerschmitt 109E, the Emil, as the model is of 1940, is the mainstay of the German fighter force in the summer of 1940. And they don't have much fuel, so they need to conserve their fuel, which means they need to be as close to Britain as they possibly can, which is why the majority of them are all in airfields which are hastily created in July 1940 following the fall of France in the Pas-de-Calais, which is the closest point. That's where the channel is its narrowest and all the rest of it, and also in the northern Normandy. And that's where they're flying from. But what that means is that even if you're completely rubbish at bombing, which the British are in 1940, they haven't developed those navigational aids that create untold accuracy by the end of the war. 1940, they don't have that luxury. It's a target-rich environment. I mean, you can barely miss if you go over to the Isle of, over to the Pas-de-Calais. I mean, it's just like one huge, great kind of hub of fighter airfields. And consequently, that means that every single German squadron, which only is 12 airplanes strong on establishment, and very often even fewer than that, always has to leave 2 airplanes behind to defend their own airfields. And it's really interesting when you look at kind of prisoner of war statements from Luftwaffe ground crew that have been downed. They're all bugged in a holding place called Trent Park. You can see the transcripts of these conversations. They're all going about how annoying it was that the RAF are over every night and they can't sleep. And, if only they'd just shut up and leave them alone and not bomb them. This is just part of the narrative of the Battle of Britain that's completely left out. It's always the stocky, the plucky few against the kind of the Nazi hordes and all the rest of it. And it's a complete misnomer. And by that time, aircraft production in Britain is massively outpacing the Germans. And the best ratio that the Germans achieve in 1940 is July 1940, when the British produced 496 new Hurricanes and Spitfires single-engine fighters, and the Germans only produced 240 single-engine fighters. That's the best ratio. And of course, that is the British outproducing the Germans 2-1. And what that means is by the end of October 1940, when the Battle of Britain is sort of, officially designated as being over, the single-engine fighter force of the Luftwaffe is less than 200 from 750 or whatever it was in the beginning of July, whereas the British fighter force had been 650 or whatever at the beginning of July is now well over 750.
And Britain is outproducing.
Yeah, to a massive degree. And that continues. And, that is a ratio that just increases as the war progresses. I mean, Britain produces 132,500 aircraft in the Second World War. America produces 315,000.
So why is there this legend of the Luftwaffe?
Well, because it's the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg.
So it has to do with the Blitzkrieg.
It's all to do with the Blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe becomes the kind of the bogeyman of the Third Reich. They're blamed for everything, but that's because they're completely abused. They're the only part of the Third Reich's armed services, the only part of the Wehrmacht being the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, that is in constant use the whole time, or constant abuse, I should say. In Britain and America, they rotate their pilots really, really carefully. By the time that you got the 8th Fighter Command, for example, part of the mighty 8th, the 8th Air Force operating in Britain. By the end of 1943, you would have in a squadron that would have 60. You would never have more than 16 airborne from a squadron at any one time. You would have 40 to 45 pilots to service 16 in the air, and similar number of aircraft, which means you're not overusing these guys. And what would happen is by that stage of the war, by 1943, a young fighter pilot coming to a Thunderbolt squadron or a Mustang squadron, for example, at the end of 1943, beginning of 1944, he'd have 350 hours of consecutive flying. And because you can train in America, in Florida or California or Texas or wherever, you can process many, many more people because the training is much more intense, because you've got clear skies. So it's not a question of we'd like to take you out Fritz this morning, but it's a bit cloudy and the RAF are over, or the 8th Air Force are over, so we can't fly today. So in Germany, pilot training is constant, aircrew training is constantly being interrupted by the war, by shortage of fuel, by inclement weather, et cetera, et cetera. In America, you have none of those problems. And Britain, because of its global reach, also has training bases in what was Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Canada as well. And so you're able to process these guys much better. You're able to give them more training. So that when they come, they're absolutely the finished article as pilots. What they're not the finished article as is, say, a bomber pilot or as a fighter pilot. But that's okay, because you join your squadron of 40 other guys for 16 airborne, and the old hands kind of take you up a few times. So you arrive at, I don't know, let's say some airfield in Suffolk in East Anglia in England, and you'll have 10 days to 2 weeks acclimatizing, getting used to it. The old hands will put you through your paces, give you some tips. You can pick their brains during kind of while you're having some chow, and listening on some briefings. Then the first mission you do will be a milk run over to France, where the danger is kind of pretty minimal, and you can build up your experience so that by the time you're actually sent over on a mission to Berlin or Bremen or the Ruhr or whatever, you're absolutely the business. So qualitatively and quantitatively, you are just vastly superior to anything the Luftwaffe's got. The Luftwaffe by that stage, in contrast, 1940, new pilots coming to frontline squadrons with 150, 170 hours in their logbooks. Less than 100, 90, 92 hours, something like that. It's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just being flung straight into battle, and they're getting absolutely slaughtered. And they're also, because their machines are quite complicated, there's no two-seaters really. So no two-seater trainers. So the first time you're flying in your Focke-Wulf 190 or your Messerschmitt 109, it's this horrendous leap of faith for which you, as a young, bright Luftwaffe fighter pilot, know that you're not ready for this. And it can bite you. Something like a Messerschmitt 109 has a very high wing loading. So it's very maneuverable in the air, but it's got these tiny wings. It's got this incredible torque, this Daimler-Benz DB605 engine with its huge amount of torque, and it just wants to flip you over. So if you're not used to it, and it's got a narrow undercarriage as well, if you're not used to it, you could just crash. So in the first couple of months of 1944, they lose something like 2,400 aircraft in the air and pilots, and about 3,400 are accidents.
So it has to do with training, really.
Yeah.
Not training enough.
It's training and resources and supply. And the Second World War, more than any other conflict, is a war of numbers. There are differences, the decisions that generals can make. There are moments where particular brilliance and bravery can seize the day, take the bridge, hold the enemy at bay or whatever. But ultimately, you're talking about differences which might make a month's difference, 6 months difference, maybe even several years difference. But ultimately, there's a certain point in the Second World War where the outcome is absolutely inevitable, because the guys that lose can't compete with the numbers that the guys are going to win at.
So in that sense, you could think of World War II as a battle of factories.
Yes.